One of the scariest movies that I've ever seen was The Conjuring 2, and I have two good reasons to back me up. One is because of this creepy old man and this specific scene.
My house!
But another reason why this movie is so scary to me is because it's based off of the real Enfield haunting. And that creepy old man, yeah, he was based on a real man who actually lived in the famous Enfield house years before the family moved in. He died in an armchair in the living room, and according to the Hodgson family, his spirit tormented them for 18 months while they lived in the home. I think any movie that says based on a true story is horrifying and will give me nightmares. But this one truly takes the cake, honestly, because of the real story behind it. You guys already know what time it is. Turn off the lights, grab a blanket, and let's talk about it. So, like I said, one of the scariest movies I've ever seen is The Conjuring 2. The movie follows demonologists Ed and Lorraine Warren all the way to Enfield, a borough in North London. They investigate the home and the haunting of the Hodgson family. They believe that their 11-year-old daughter is possessed by the spirit of a 72-year-old man who previously died in the home. What they weren't expecting was just how dangerous the Enfield poltergeist turned out to be. This is one of the higher-rated movies in the Conjuring universe, and although nothing will beat the first one for me, this is a very close second, but the real story and family the movie is based off of is incredibly creepy. That is, if it actually happened. So this is the Hodgson family, which consists of mom Peggy and her 4 kids. Margaret, who was 13 years old at the time this took place, Janet, who was 11, Johnny, who was 10, and Billy, who was 7. In the summer of 1977, the Hodgson family was living in this house right here, 284 Green Street in Enfield, London. From the outside looking in, this looks like your typical family home where nothing bad ever happens. But one summer night, that would all change, and it would spark an 18-month-long nightmare with the unexplained. So one night, long after the kids were already in bed, Peggy heard loud crashing sounds coming from upstairs. She instantly got mad because it sounded like it was coming from her daughter's rooms, Janet and Margaret, which they shared. But it sounded like they were really roughhousing, so as Peggy marched up the stairs, ready to scold her kids, she opened the door and instead found something horrifying. Her 2 girls, Janet and Margaret, huddled in the corner of the room, scared out of their mind. They weren't making a sound, but something definitely was. And as Peggy looked around, she noticed that a dresser in the room was slamming itself against the floor, completely on its own. It eventually stopped, but once it did, the family started hearing loud knocks coming from all over the house, and there was seemingly no explanation why. So being super scared, the family ran to their next door neighbor Vic and begged him to come over to see what was going on. So he did. When Vic entered the house, he too saw the dresser moving on its own, and he also heard the loud knocks coming from all over the house and inside the walls. It sounded like something was inside and wanting to come out. The situation was terrifying enough that Peggy actually called the Metropolitan Police, and they sent out an officer to investigate the home. And what's crazy is that this officer also noticed the knocking, but that's not all they saw. The officer signed an affidavit saying they saw an armchair levitate half an inch off the ground, and then it moved about 4 feet across the floor, completely on its own. So not only did you have the family and the neighbor witness this activity, now you have an actual police officer who wrote this into their incident report. Sadly, the officer told Peggy that they couldn't help because this technically was not a legal issue, so they left, leaving the family alone in the house. Over the next 18 months, the family said that they were tormented, and the paranormal activity escalated. It started out as the kids' toys being thrown all over the room and the loud knocking all over the house, and then it got even scarier. Chairs would be overturned, they would feel cold spots in random places that also smelled like rotten flesh, pools of water would appear right in front of their eyes on the floor, matches would spontaneously ignite, and then the family began being physically attacked. The kids would levitate, and all of the paranormal activity was really centered on Janet and Margaret. This is an infamous photo from when paranormal investigators came out to the house that supposedly shows Janet levitating off the bed, but we'll get more into that in just a second. But the family would start to hear disembodied, demonic voices that sounded like they were coming out of Janet, but the only problem was that she wasn't moving her mouth. Like, this voice that came out of her was deep and scratchy, and some people think that there is no way way it would have naturally come out of an 11-year-old little girl. The paranormal activity got so bad around Janet that the family actually thought that she was possessed. Like, she would go into these trance-like states and that low, scratchy male voice would come out of her. This poltergeist said its name was Bill Wilkins and that he had gone blind, suffered a brain hemorrhage, and died in the living room chair right down the stairs, all in that creepy voice. Now, this obviously creeped the family out because why would an 11-year-old girl say those things? And also because they were just renting the home. They didn't own it, so it's not like they really knew the history of it. Or so they said. Anyway, what's crazy is that this haunting, which became known as the Enfield haunting, became known as one of the most witnessed cases of paranormal activity ever. And there's good reason for that. I mean, typically when you hear ghost stories, you only ever hear of 1 or 2 people experiencing the ghost, not a ton of people. But over the 18 months that the Hodgson family was being tormented in that house, more than 30 people in the community all witnessed the paranormal activity too. Like, this included neighbors, paranormal investigators, journalists, and even strangers walking by on the street. One time a stranger was walking down the road and looked up into what we now know was Janet's bedroom window. And what she saw is straight up nightmare fuel. She saw Janet hovering above her bed, almost smashing into the window. But literally everyone that stepped foot into the house, they all said they saw heavy furniture moving on its own, objects being thrown across the room, both Janet and Margaret levitating off the ground, and heard the knocking and loud noises, as well as the disembodied demon voice coming out of Janet. Like, this wasn't just a few people that witnessed it. It was basically the whole community, which is wild. Anyway, after a while of the family experiencing this and spending so many sleepless nights huddled together in the living room with the lights on, they ended up calling a popular UK publication called the Daily Mirror. They didn't know what else to do, they said, so they called the publication to come out and witness it for themselves. So they did. But hours went by with not a single thing happening. That is, until right before they started to leave. As one of the reporters got up to leave, a Lego was thrown across the room without anyone touching it, and it hit him right in the face, which left a pretty big wound. So needless to say, they wanted to continue to report on this story. The Daily Mirror ended up inviting the Society for Psychical Research, otherwise known as SPR, which is a non-profit organization that examines paranormal and psychic events. They invited them out to the Enfield home to truly investigate and see what was going on. And during their stay in the home, they said they experienced more than 2,000 incidents of paranormal activity. Everything I mentioned earlier, they heard. But one of the scarier incidents involved a curtain being tightly wrapped around one of the investigators' necks, all on its own, choking him. Some of the investigators also heard this strange whistling and barking noise coming from Janet's direction, but she wasn't the one making the noises. But in order to truly understand if this home was being haunted by a poltergeist named Bill, the Committee of the Scientific Investigation of Claims of the Paranormal, otherwise known as CSICOP, they came out to the home to conduct further investigations. They had a stakeout in the house for quite a long time, and investigators with this team set up microphones and cameras all over the house. They even had remote-controlled still cameras set up in the girls' room, which were timed to take pictures every 15 seconds. The team did end up catching the disembodied voice coming out of Janet and the loud knocking on the walls, which I'll play for you here.
Shut the door. I'm 72 years old. I come from Jewel Park graveyard, and I have right near the church where Rita lives. And all my friends come from there as well. And we all make a game and go to the pub, and then we pick your house, because I used to live here.
But then they caught something else, which nobody was planning. They caught the girls pranking them. Like, some of the demonic activity that they said was happening, Janet was actually faking and doing herself. Cameras caught Janet bending spoons and trying to bend an iron bar. And the banging that was happening in the house, the cameras caught Janet doing a lot of it. She would bang a broom handle on the ceiling, and she even hid some of the investigators' equipment. When they brought this up to Janet, she confessed and even admitted to pranking the journalists and investigators. She claimed that she faked about 2% of what was happening and played it up to make the story seem scarier than it was. But she was adamant that the rest of it was real. Because of this confession, a lot of people started doubting the Hodgson family, even the paranormal investigators and journalists. They thought, well, if they admitted to faking some, then how much of it is real? Investigators were then able to kind of explain away some of the findings with logical answers. They thought that the girls were just playing tricks and exaggerating, and that what they were experiencing was nothing more than an imaginative teenager. The camera and tape recorder malfunctions could be easily explained by simple glitches in the equipment. And the famous levitating photo of Janet, well, investigators came full circle on that. What they once thought was a girl who was possessed, they now felt like it was just Janet jumping off the bed like a trampoline. I mean, it's kind of obvious by looking at it. Like the photos side by side don't really show levitating. And they brought up the fact that Janet was pretty athletic, so they felt like this was just her doing gymnastics and further pranking people. As for the disembodied voice known as Bill that came out of Janet, some people think it would be too hard for an 11-year-old to keep talking in such a deep and scratchy voice for hours at a time, like Janet did. But others think the male voice was just a vocal trick, that it was Janet all along, seeing what she could get away with. Skeptics in the CSI COP said that the poltergeist voice had the phraseology and vocabulary of a child, and that it would suddenly change topics, which on the surface may not seem like a big deal, but changing topics was a habit that Janet also had. So it seemed like more and more evidence was piling up that suggested maybe this whole thing was fake, that none of the haunting actually happened. And to make matters worse, demonologists Ed and Lorraine Warren came to investigate, but not like it was shown in the Conjuring 2 movie. In fact, Ed and Lorraine only investigated the house for one day in the summer of 1978. They, of course, were convinced that the house was haunted and that Janet was possessed. But then they did something a little odd. They didn't truly investigate. They just told the other paranormal researchers that were there that, quote, that real money could be made by writing books about the incident and selling movie rights. Then they suddenly left. I've already kind of touched on how Ed and Lorraine Warren have a sketchy past and how a lot of people think they were frauds, but this just feeds into that scenario. The whole situation was kind of sus, but do with that information as you will. And the other investigators there knew that Ed was known for exaggerating, and they even said themselves that he would take a simple haunting case and turn it into demonic possession. At the end of the day, every single research team left with no real proof that the Enfield haunting was real. It was all just speculation. The general consensus is that it was made up for attention, and kind of what fed into that was some interviews done by Margaret and Janet. In one that was filmed for TV, the interviewer asked Janet, quote, "How does it feel to be haunted by a poltergeist?" End quote. In which Janet responded, quote, "It's not haunted." End quote. And then she laughed and smiled. Margaret then told her to shut up, but it's just weird. And during the interview, Janet would wave her hand in front of her mouth every single time the disembodied male voice would be heard. So at that point, it kind of all felt like a scam from the family. But this didn't stop the case from being in the news and going on to become a documentary. It got so bad that Janet said that she was bullied in school for it, and that kids would put crane flies down her back. A priest eventually visited the home in 1978. After which, the haunting was said to have died down, but the family said that it never fully stopped. Billy, the youngest child, continued to live in the Enfield house all the way up until his mom died, and he said that even then, it always felt like he was being watched. But this family went on to have such a hard life. Like I said, Peggy ended up passing away, as did their dad. Johnny ended up dying of cancer at just 14 years old, and one of Janet's own kids later on in life ended up passing away in his sleep at just 18 years old. They did not have a very easy life, which is sad. After the Hodgson family moved out, a new family moved into the home. It was a woman named Claire and her 4 sons, and they too agreed that it always felt like they were being watched. The kids would be woken up in the middle of the night to voices coming from downstairs. And the final straw was when one of the boys woke up in the middle of the night to a man running into his room, but the man was not there. The family moved out the very next day, and they'd only stayed in the house for 2 months. The only thing that doesn't really make sense to me is that although this is proven to be somewhat of a hoax, that doesn't explain how so many people in the community, even a police officer, witnessed the paranormal activity themselves. Like, it wasn't just the family, it was over 30 people. And then what creeps me out even more is that years later, the unexplained demonic voice that came out of Janet was played on a radio talk show as part of discussing the case. And a listener of the show came forward and said something horrifying. They identified the voice as their late father, William Wilkins, or as he liked to be called, Bill. The listener said that Bill lived in the Enfield home years before the Hodgson family, and that in 1963, he had gone blind, suffered a hemorrhage, and died in the armchair in the living room, which, if you remember, is exactly what Janet had said when she was possessed. So it's weird to me that Bill Wilkins actually existed and really lived in the home, and how more than 30 people witnessed the paranormal phenomena. But at the same time, it's been debunked as a hoax. I guess it's totally possible that the family knew that Bill really died in the house and just lied about it. But still, it doesn't really explain everything else. All I know is that this case went on to inspire one of the creepiest movies I've ever seen. The Conjuring 2. Now, a lot of that movie was played up and didn't actually happen, but I am still a fan. I don't know. What do you guys think? There is so much evidence suggesting that this was all a hoax, but I don't know, I love a good creepy ghost story, so I'm torn. But it's now been 49 years, and although the Enfield house still stands and is lived in by others, what really happened inside those walls remains a mystery.